Now we're going to talk about the progressive movement, more of a social movement. Okay, make sure you know this. The populist movement, which we've already talked about, was a rural movement mainly to help the farmers. The progressive movement was mainly an urban movement dealing with urban problems. So think populist farmers, progressive, urban. And you know, urban means city. Okay, industrialization resulted in the rise in the number of new goods and services, increase in middle class, widening the gap between the rich and the poor, creating unsafe working conditions, and created crowded cities. Okay, all of these things are going to lead to problems in the cities. With the overcrowded cities, things are going to become unsanitary. We already know about the unsafe working conditions. The widening gap between the rich and the poor. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. So all of these are going to lead to problems in the urban areas. Okay, who exactly were these progressives? Now, the progressives were people who wanted to change things. They were also known as reformers. They were usually native born here in the United States. They were middle to upper class, such as doctors, engineers, ministers, small business owners, social workers, teachers, and writers. Many of them, of course, college educated, and they were usually urban, born, raised, or were living in the city at the time. Now, progressive issues, things that they needed to change: political corruption, sanitation in the city, women's suffrage, safer working condition, end to child labor. It goes on and on. They wanted equal rights for African Americans. Um, it just it There's more than this that we need to list. Okay, muckrakers. A muckraker was an investigative journalist that would write about a social, political, or business issue. They raked up and exposed the muck or the filth of society. Muckrakers, they were journalists that wrote about things that the people needed to know about. And let me give you some examples. Okay, magazine articles were Tweed Days of St. Louis by Lincoln Steffens. He wrote about the political machines. History of the Standard Oil Company by Ida Tarbell. She wrote about the Standard Oil Company and the dishonest ways that it made its money. And books Shame of the City by Lincoln Steffens and The Jungle of Upton Sinclair. And we've spoken about the jungle before, about the meatpacking plant. Okay, the problem here is, these are examples of muckrakers. Corrupt city bosses such as Boss William Tweed of New York City, and we've already spoken about him. With the 1873 conviction behind him, Tweed was sued by the New York State for $6 million. Held in debtor's prison until he could post half of that amount as bail, the former boss had few options. Still wealthy, his prison cell was fairly luxurious. Yet Tweed was determined to escape, flee into Spain. He worked as a common seaman on a Spanish ship until recognized by his likeness to the Nas cartoon and captured. Exonerated to New York, William Marcy Tweed died in debtor's prison on April 12, 1878. And here is a political cartoon that Nas drew, and it's depicting, William Tweed as a thief. See the stripes? He's in jail. All right, let's go to the next one. And here's a quote from Tweed. Says, "Stop them darn pictures," the boss supposedly said. "I don't care so much what the papers write about. My constituents can't read, but darn it, they can see pictures." William Marcy Tweed. So he was upset because William Nast Thomas Nast, was drawing these cartoons in the paper, and it was causing people to turn against him. And then you have another problem such as overcrowded, unsanitary, and unsafe housing and working conditions. And Jacob Riis, he published a book called How the Other Half Lives, and it exposed the horrible conditions of the poor and living in the cities. And you notice, this is where these men lived, and we look, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, at least 7 living in this one room. So very crowded, unsafe, unsanitary. And I'm going to let you read this. You can pause it and read this. Is an excerpt from Jacob Riis, How the Other Half Lives. Okay, muckrakers also targeted child labor, and we've discussed this before. And muckraker Jacob Riis, a photographer and author, How the Other Half Lives. Laws were passed to clean the streets, limit child labor, and to provide safer working conditions. Because of his work, charities were developed to help the poor. Hull House, YMCA, YWCA, and Salvation Army were all started. And I'm going to let you read this. You can pause it, the video, and read this. This is an excerpt from Ida Tarbell's John D. Rockefeller, A Character Study from McClure's Magazine, July 1906. So pause this and read the excerpt from the article. And here's Ida Tarbell. The problem that she went after was unfair business practices by Standard Oil and other trusts, and she was a journalist for McClure's Magazine, and the reform that was brought about by her stories led to the demand for tighter controls of trusts. And then you have The Jungle, which we've already spoken about, by Upton Sinclair. And I'm not going to read this to you. I'll let you pause the video and read this. This is an excerpt from his book, The Jungle, about the meatpacking plant in Chicago. And here's Upton Sinclair and the book, The Jungle. The problem, the filthy, unsanitary conditions of the meatpacking industry. Upton Sinclair, laws that were changed, reform. Laws were passed to improve meat inspection. Alright, let's go on to reform in the workplace. In 1900, the average laborer worked nearly 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, for about $1.50 a day. Now, reformer Florence Kelley worked for new laws that would prohibit or limit child labor and improve conditions for females. And here's a political cartoon, Kill the Child, Save the Machine. And here's a child working in a factory, and it says, don't waste the machine's time, keep it at top speed. And this is just illustrating how the most important thing to the factory owners were keeping the machines running. If a child got hurt, hey, that's okay. They could replace that child with another child. You got to keep the machine running. That's what makes that's what's making the money. Now, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. A fire broke out in a factory. All the doors except for one were locked, and over 140 women were killed. As a result of the fire, the New York legislature enacted the nation's strictest fire safety codes. And we saw a video about this on America, the Story of Us. And it was unsafe. There were no regulations about having the doors unlocked and things like that, or the upkeep of the fire escape. And when the fire broke out, the women couldn't get out because more than one of the doors were locked. And then when they started going down the fire escape fell and ended up causing the death of over 140 women. And because of this, and it been in the papers about how tragic it was, New York ended up passing the strictest fire safety codes, so the government got involved and became wanted to regulate safety in the workplace. Labor unions continue to fight for better working conditions and for a closed shop. A closed shop is a workplace where all the employees must belong to a union. Now, an open shop, workers could choose whether or not they wanted to join a union. So, we've talked about labor unions before. A lot of this should be a review for you. And socialism, we've talked about socialism before. Socialism was a system under which the government or worker cooperatives owned most factories, utilities, and transportation and communication systems. It is an economic system where individuals are not allowed to own their own businesses. The government or the community does. The United States has a capitalist economic system where individuals can own their own business. Think about Sam Walton, who started Walmart. If he was living in a country that had a socialist economic system, he wouldn't have been able to do that. Now, the American Federation of Labor, here's a labor union we've already spoken about. They were founded by Samuel Gompers. They excluded unskilled workers, and they believed within working in the system, trying to negotiate and get things met, get their demands met before going to strike. And ILGW stands for the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. This was a labor union for women who worked in the garment industry, who made clothing. They were members in a sewing factory. In the uprising of 20,000, women went on strike. More than in just one city, it was multiple cities all at the same time trying to get higher pay and safer working conditions. And then you have the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, also known as the Wobblies. Their leader was William Big Bill Haywood. Now, he was opposed to capitalism, or the Industrial Workers of the World were opposed to capitalism, and they supported socialism. Now, how did they reach their goal? With boycotts, general strikes, and industrial sabotage. Industrial sabotage is where one of the machines would break, and then by the time they got it fixed, another machine would break, and it would slow down production. When their goals were met, the machinery would stop breaking down. That's industrial sabotage. Industrial Workers of the World. Many Americans grew fearful of IWW's revolutionary methods and goals. Remember, they supported socialism. The United States supports capitalism. Most Americans support capitalism because we are a capitalist economic system. And let's go real quick to social reform. As urban population soared, cities struggled to provide garbage collection, safe and affordable housing, health care, police and fire protection, and adequate public education. Now, moral reform. Progressives wanted to clean up what they considered to be immoral behavior. Prohibition was one thing they went after. It was a ban on the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. The Anti-Saloon League and the Women's Christian Temperance Union led the crusade against alcohol. Carrie Nation was a lady who worked with the Women's Christian Temperance Union trying to stop the sale of alcohol, trying to get the government to make a law prohibiting alcohol. And one thing they did was they went around to bars and saloons, and they would go in and they would take their Bibles and their hymn books, and they would go in and they would sing while these men were there trying to enjoy a drink, and they would be singing, gospel songs. Carrie Nation was known for carrying a hatchet with her, and when she went into the bars and the saloons, she would bust up the barrels and the bottles. Alright, let me let you have a look at Miss Carrie Nation. Yeah, to me she looks very scary, not a very nice lady. Here's a cartoon with Miss Carrie Nation. Your nutty Aunt Carrie is loose again. And of course she's riding on Prohibition, and this is supposed to be Carrie Nation, and there's her hatchet. In 1917, Congress proposed the 18th Amendment, which barred the manufacture, sale, and distribution of alcoholic beverages. The states ratified it in 1919. Ratify means to begin to enforce it. So, by 1919, Prohibition was in full swing, and it was against the law to buy, sell, or distribute alcoholic beverages. Please know this, it was the 18th Amendment. Now, movie-going, many people believe that movies were a threat to morality. Now, if we could see the movies back then, I mean, they were silent, no sound. The music was played there at the movie theater, and there was no foul language. You might have a kissing scene, but many people considered that immoral. The first movie to tell a story was The Great Train Robbery. It was 5 or 10 cents movie tickets bought at movie houses, also called Nickelodeons, and reformers demanded that movies be censored. Now, progressives and racial discrimination. Few white progressives devoted very much energy to the problem of discrimination and prejudice against African Americans. It was mainly African Americans working, trying to get things changed. There were a few white people that did work with this. They met in Niagara Falls and created a group called the NAACP, and that was created by African American and white people who wanted to try to end discrimination against African Americans. Booker T. Washington was the head of an all-black training school called the Tuskegee Institute. Many African Americans opposed Booker T. Washington because of his acceptance of segregation. He felt that African Americans needed to become important in the economy through work, through jobs, and gradually get equal rights and end segregation. He was not one that wanted to demand immediate rights. He thought that it would be best for African Americans to gradually obtain those rights. And here he is. He was a former slave, taught himself how to read. He founded the Tuskegee Institute, and is still a leading black college today. And then you had W.E.B. Du Bois. He was the first African American to earn a doctorate from Harvard. He was a strong civil rights supporter. He believed that access to college education and vocational training offered the best chances for African Americans. He was co-founder of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And here's Mr. W.B. Du Bois, African American professor, author, and public speaker. Du Bois disagreed with Booker T. Washington's acceptance of segregation. He thought that African Americans should get equal rights just like everyone else because they were citizens just like everyone else, and they should not have to wait for those rights. NAACP was an organization dedicated to ending racial discrimination. Monthly magazine was The Crisis, and W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the editors. The grandfather clause was used to bar African Americans from voting, but to keep white eligibles to vote. Okay, what that was, you had the literacy test. The purpose of it was to keep African Americans from voting. Well, the problem was there were white people that couldn't read also. So what they did was they said, well, if your father or your grandfather was able to vote prior to 1865, you didn't have to take the literacy test. Well, 1865 is when slavery ended. So there's not going to be any African Americans eligible to vote prior to 1865. So that ruled that out for them. But most white people, their father or grandfather was eligible to vote, so they didn't have to take the test. And that's called the grandfather clause. And Americanization, many progressives supported Americanization, a process of preparing foreign-born residents for full U.S. citizenship. These efforts to assimilate immigrants or to make them more like native-born Americans focused on education. Okay, go back, rewatch this, pause it, take down some notes that you think might be important, and I will post the next video tomorrow.